Hey guys, welcome back to Enlightened. Today we're going to be taking a quick look into our history again. This is a video by Amplex. You need to hear this. History is not what we are told. Ain't that the truth? So this is going to be a live reaction pretty much. I've not seen this video yet. I see he's got an image of the Great Pyramids up on screen. I'm hoping it's not an Egyptian based Middle Eastern kind of video. I'm hoping this is more of a globalization video on global history and civilizations such as like Tartaria and things like that. Like I said, I haven't seen it, so this is going to be a live reaction. Let's get right into it.
An interesting thing. What if history was wrong though? And how long would it take to hide history completely and to create a completely fabricated history? How long do you think it would take? Now, realistically, it might take 3 generations, but there is a way you could actually do it in one. And if you really look at the world, things are very, very different to what we think. This was a huge nation that once existed on the earth that's been expunged from our history books.
Happy days. It looks like he is going to go into Tartaria, because obviously anyone who's looked into the topic will understand that all the yellow on this map is designated as Tartaria. As you can see over on the left, North America dominated by Tartaria, Central South America dominated by Tartaria, and across the what looks like the Himalayas, India, Pakistan, the Middle East, all the way across Siberia to China. You know, it truly was, if it existed, it truly was a global civilization. And I am going to do a video, quite detailed actually, on maps and cities regarding Tartaria. The research is quite long, to be fair, in terms of putting everything together, but it's a video I have started, and hopefully it will be out pretty soon.
And all we've got really left is tartan cloth and tartare sauce. You don't really hear about these people at all. And it's actually documented as recently as 1942. It was a worldwide empire. It was signified by things like this, these star forts. It would surprise you to know that there are star forts all over Europe from this ancient culture. A lot of Holland is made of star forts. The town Haarlem that I go and stay in very often is a star fort.
Obviously, Holland being mentioned as one of the places where one of the lost tribes resided as a nation on the sea. And if you go to Holland, the nation is full of star forts, as you just mentioned, because it's full of waterways. There's actually parts of Holland that is situated on the sea. It is known as a part of the nation is actually below sea level. So it's very fascinating.
The Vatican is an old star fort.
Sorry, just a quick. I've actually done a video on this topic, Snowflake star forts, called the video. So if anyone's interested, I'll put a link in the description. Please check it out.
These star forts are found all over the world, all across Europe, and legends of Atlantis and things like that. You know, lost cultures beneath the oceans. Actually, folks, Atlantis is everywhere. There are so many lost civilizations beneath the waters. There's lost cultures beneath the off the coast of Indonesia. There's lost cultures off the coast of Los Angeles. There's lost cultures off the coast of San Diego. All the Mediterranean is full of sunken cities. It's everywhere. Atlantis was a worldwide culture, and it was probably the culture that preceded Tartaria. You find the remnants of this culture everywhere. These buildings. Who builds buildings like this? Now, these are incredibly beautiful, these buildings. Why can't we build them anymore? We can't build them anymore. Any of these buildings. We find them everywhere. Who built these incredible places? You know?
Sorry to interrupt again, but I've also done a video on Tartarian buildings. It's not the most in-depth video, but it gives you good examples like this of buildings that have been destroyed from our history. Some buildings were only standing for like 2 years, that were made out of some of the most exotic stonework that you can find. Very elaborate, very detailed, very high level masonry, and the buildings were within a couple of years wiped out.
There's remnants of them in our culture. Think about this. The Queen Victoria building in Sydney, built in 1820. 1820, okay? This is Sydney, circa 1820. Okay? Australia settled in 1778. And in 50 years, they did this with the convicts that they brought out here. Remember convicts they brought out here? Well, while they were doing that, they just thought they would build all this incredible Roman, Grecian-style European architecture, as you do when you're colonising a country. You know, and all these convicts, they were just held stonemasons. They went out, they dug all these quarries, they quarried all these stones, they had all this machinery to build all this stuff. All is already here. And we're told that, you know, these people...
Sorry, there's a good moment to pause, sorry. Yeah, and like I say, I've done a video on some of these buildings, but you could do like 10 hours worth of videography on architecture of ancient peoples, potentially. But it's one of the interesting note to make there is that, like he said, within the space of 50 years, you had an entire city built out of the ground by convicts. Now, that's not impossible. You know, you're only going back 200 years. You know, you're talking about the Industrial Revolution. There was a capacity to build on a large scale back then. However, it's the intricacy, the level of detail, and also some of the weathering that you find on some of these buildings. They just it just seems to go way back. And then, like he says, you know, the European Greco-Roman design. This is not isolated to Europe. It's in North America. I do believe some spots in South America, right across the Pan Pacific into Japan, China, and then you keep coming across into India, the Baltics and Siberia, like across Russia, into Northern Europe, right across Europe, as up to Great Britain and Ireland. You know, it's a full stretch around the world, over the world. If you're flat earther, ball earther, whichever, you know, you can't deny the fact that there's a there's a common architecture amongst the peoples of the world. Now, are you going to tell me that every new culture that decides to design, spend great amounts of money and time and effort into building these buildings would all copy a common blueprint? I find that hard to believe, especially when you see the diversity in language, in culture, and, you know, fashion, whatever you want to look at. There's diversity right across the world. Yet the brickwork, the architecture is commonplace across the world. So it really is a fascinating discussion to have with people.
People, in 50 years after they settled, they built these buildings. But you can find, like I said, this culture, Tartaria, which is all these buildings, these copper top buildings, all of this same architecture that you can find all around the world. In the Philippines, you can even find this architecture in Japan before the Europeans came to Japan. When Japan was closed, before they let Europeans in, there's every indication that when Tartaria fell, the remnants of it went to Japan. Another thing that's really interesting is this sort of architecture that we find all around the place, these buildings with these lower levels. What causes this? Why would you build a building below ground like that? What does that look like?
So obviously, I think he's going to go into the mud flood here. Now, I just want to make my statement now on the mud flood. I don't know if the mud flood took place, though. If you go back and look through Greek historians, like I believe again it was Herodotus who mentioned this about Atlantis. He said they will never speak of mud again, and the reason behind that statement is he believes that when Atlantis was flooded and the Straits of Hercules were broken, and basically the ocean that used to be in the Sahara Desert swashed across the desert, took out Atlantis and drained out into the Atlantic Ocean to near the Canary Islands. I have done a video where I do show Mauritania as Atlantis for reference point there. And it's interesting the way he spoke of mud, and he says they will never speak of mud again. And here we are in 2021, and we're seeing remnants of these old buildings having higher ground levels around them, almost as if a mud flood did take place and then there was a clearing. And you can go online and there's multiple videos, multiple photographs and theories of how, where and why these mud floods happened. But the common denominator seems to be that it came in a period of time when, going back to the 1800s, when we started to see major transformations on a global scale. Now, I have my own theories about the British Empire and subsequent empires in Europe, you know, other empires like the Spanish Empire, the German Empire, the Dutch Empire, the French Empire, etc., and how so many smaller nations on a global scale were able to export globally. And the exportation globally seems to be of culture, language and skin colour. There seems to be large populations leaving Europe and going to places like America, Australia, you know, etc. And in doing so, when they've exported this culture worldwide, I can't help but wonder if there was already a culture in place globally, and what we've seen during the 1700s, the 1800s, the 1900s and the 20th century in general, really up until the 50s, we've seen pockets of resistance all across the globe. We've seen revolutions, we've seen collapsing of royal families, dynasties, We've seen countries eradicated, new borders formed. Now this always happens, you know, throughout history's conquest and this kind of thing, etc., etc. However, one of the main interesting points for me is when you go and look into places like South Africa and you look at the Boer Wars. Now, go and look at the Boer Wars and go and tell me that that was a legit conflict, because you had so many people known as the Boers who occupied lands in South Africa. They claimed to be Germanic and Dutch settlers. Believe into that what you will. However, they were there, they were established, they had towns, cities, and a full-on infrastructure. Yet when Britain came to war with the Boers, we had 2 wars with them, and in both of those wars, we eradicated the lineage, the history, and the culture that existed there. And obviously, South Africa became a British colony, overseas territory. Now, the Boers, when they were having shootouts with these people, there's no talk of superior weaponry. However, as somebody who was in the military myself, I was always fascinated to find this out. When they had engagements and contacts with each other, it was the Boers won almost every contact, and it wasn't until, and this was due to superior range of shooting and superior accuracy. Now, allegedly they had the same rifles, but somehow the Boers were able to dominate every conflict with the British Empire at this point in time, who was dominating in terms of conflicts with other nations, beat Napoleon and all this kind of stuff. Yeah, the Boers, like you say, they weren't able to match them in an engagement, and it was only after the Brits went around the conflict zone into the towns that the Boers were living in, took the women and children and placed them in concentration camps. Now that's Nazi Germany kind of stuff that. And then you look over the other side of the pond when you see the American Revolution and things like that. You know, at this point in time, the Americans are still migrating west. Yeah, if you go and look at some of the buildings out west, they are just as intricate, just as detailed, and just as impressive as the building on screen right now. And yet, it's claimed that these buildings popped up basically overnight, and not individual buildings, entire settlements. And then if you go back and look on the maps, the older maps, there's actually known cities out west in America before America became the 50 states, you know. So I'm sorry I went on a bit of a ramble there, but let's just get back to the video.
Does that look like it was built like that? You know, you're finding these things all over the world, which indicate that there is a culture that exists beneath this culture, and quite recently something happened. Some sort of we're calling it a mud flood, for want of a better word, what it is. But we're finding everywhere. This is Pittsburgh. They're digging out the foundations to put in a new building. What's all this stuff? This is painted walls. This is the outside of a culture that existed 12 feet, 18 feet, 20 feet below the street in a modern city. Even when you look at the maps of the United States and you look at San Francisco, some of the strange architecture, the strange old architecture in San Francisco, the San Francisco sewer system. Have you looked at the San Francisco sewer system? It's this huge multi-level. When did they do that? The gold rush, and they came out and they did all that stuff in the 1800s or the 1700s, and they settled San Francisco, and they just thought we'd just build this huge, massive, multi-level, multi-story freaking sewer system out of billions and billions and billions of bricks. Who built all this stuff? Was it really there? Or was it there before? Why do you find maps from the 1500s and 1400s which show the United States fully mapped, and then you find maps from when Columbus came later on where it's only half mapped, because they hadn't conquered the rest of it. They hadn't wiped out all the remnants of time.
Thank you. If I didn't lose anybody during that ramble that I've just had there, I apologise that was quite a ramble. But he's just doubling down on what I've just said. You know, there was military conquest involved in the expansion of empires. Of course there was. However, how did so many European nations conquer the world? Now, I myself, like I touched on before, I won't go into another ramble, I'll just say this. We have something in society now known as the left and the right. We have things like Judeo-Christian values, conservatism, religious, pious, community aspects, and we have liberalisation, socialism, communism, globalism on the other side of the aisle, atheism, etc. They are the two spheres that have always come into contact with each other. Obviously, go back thousands of years as well, you'd have one religion versus another religion, that could cause conflicts, of course, still see that today. However, they are subtle undertones. They are normally a few thousand people involved, a few hundred people, one community versus another. The biggest one I've seen in recent years is obviously the Catholics and Protestants, in Ireland and things like that. However, these two spheres, if you will, conservatism versus globalism, if you will, these two spheres cannot coexist because the core values are so far apart. Now, that's not to say that they can't be cordial and have a certain relationship, but you can't have an infrastructure that pleases both, because you've got two totally different ideologies and views of the world, what is right and what is wrong. So what I think, I said I wasn't going to go on a ramble, apologies. So what I'm starting to believe and starting to see is that, we've seen this leftist mentality that we have in the world today. I believe we're almost getting in towards the end game of these people now. They got rid of royal families a few hundred years ago. They got rid of entire civilizations a few hundred years ago. And even up until the 1950s, there's talk about Germany and the Second World War. And I honestly don't know what happened there. And I've watched many documentaries, I've had many conversations. I still don't know if Great Britain and America was on the right side of the war. Now, you could say, well, what are you talking about? The Jews in concentration camps and enslavement and things like this. And don't get me wrong, if that took place, then I know which side of the fence I'm sitting on, just like anyone else. But like I said earlier on in the video, it's so difficult now, even in 2021, with all this technology and information, to really understand what happened. There's so many documents and pieces of information that get put under lock and key, and they get put in a box for 100 years until everybody associated had passed away. So from generation to generation, like this man touched on, it's so difficult to actually pinpoint accurate information and then line it up with official documentation. For one, the official documentation, it depends on what sphere that official resides in, whether it's institutionalized, scientific, atheist, Marxist, communism, university ideology, or whether it's a free-thinking, conservative, more dynamic individual. And as we've all seen in universities, if you're on this side of the fence and you put a paper forward in university, you'll actually get marked down for going against the information that this side wants you to say. So I'll leave it there, but like I say, I do believe that when we seen the migration across America out west, I believe that was, and we've seen British expansion into Africa, India, etc., etc. I do believe that what we've seen was this, what we call the left today. I believe that this was the overtaking of the more spiritual aspect of humanity, hence why in the last century we've had things like the moon hoax, all this kind of stuff where it's just doubling down the atheism sphere over our lives and our history. But sorry again, let's carry on. Come back in touch.
Because they haven't conquered the rest of it. They haven't wiped out all the remnants of tartaria. So when we're looking for ancient cultures and lost civilizations, we go to Egypt, we look for the pyramids, we go to Peru, we look at Sacsayhuaman and all these places. And it's interesting when you go to the walls in Peru and Sacsayhuaman and all these places, they look very, very fresh. They don't look like they're hundreds and hundreds of years old at all. They look very, very fresh. All the joins on the walls, all the edges of them, they're all neatly beveled. They look like they're very fresh. The thing is, when we're looking for these lost civilizations, we don't look right here, what's in our own backyard and what is all around us in some of these old cities. In Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane and Adelaide, you can find buildings that simply shouldn't be there. Not if our history is correct, But it surprised you to also learn that there are also old maps that show land at the North Pole. Why don't ever flights fly over the North Pole? It's interesting. I'm not saying there's land there, but it's interesting that you find dozens and dozens of these maps.
Sorry, just to interject again. I am actually going to do an in-depth video on some maps and the cartography over the past couple of hundred years. Maybe, I don't know how far back I'm going to go. I think I'm just going to try and make the example of the fact that Tartaria was an empire and is shown on maps. But it's the cities that you see within the empires that really gets my attention, because it's going to take a while for me to really source all the data and overlay all the maps and things like that. But it's something I've already started working on, and I'm hoping to get that video out pretty soon, so just keep an eye out for that, guys.
From the 14 and 1500s, which showed there's land at the North Pole. Very interesting stuff. And would it also surprise you to know that around about 1880, most of the world was repopulated with children. You go to the foundlings and the orphan trains. There were these orphan trains that went across the United States. which took around about 200,000 children per annum from east to west across the United States to repopulate all the west coast with children. There was 100,000 children a year sent out to Australia, 100,000 children sent out to New Zealand, to Africa, all to colonise these colonies. Why don't we hear about this in our history? Now, how many of the convicts that were sent out here were child workers that were sent out here to clean up after whatever caused this event, which wiped out the culture that was here before, and were taught whatever history you want to teach them? Yep.
So you just see that hundreds and hundreds of thousands of children. Now, again, the point is, can you erase history in a single generation? If you've got thousands and thousands of children under the scope of a few hundred adults, and those adults back then, you know, not many of them would have been able to fully read and write and things like that, and would have been that cultured on world history. You know, people were a lot more involved in the rat race back then. You sense, you know, things like food, shelter were a lot more important to these people, like a lot more hard to come by to these people than it is for ourselves today. But the fact that you've got all these thousands and thousands of children and a few thousand adults, you know, who's educating these children on what's happened here, there, and why they're here and there? Probably nobody, because where's the stories, where's the interviews with these people? Like the man just mentioned, you know, we don't hear of this. Like I touched on myself earlier on, we don't hear of this thing in our textbooks in school, in this institutionalised sphere over here of atheism and hard socialist ideologies. They dominate these people dominate like the educational systems, the university campuses. They occupy the mind of the youth, and these people who they occupy the mind of are the ones who eventually go out into the system and then regurgitate the information they're being taught. And like, I can't believe that we've never heard of this, you know, hundreds of thousands of people. I mean, I personally have, but, you know, he's probably got people in his audience there. There might be people who watch this video and think to themselves, wow. Now, think about the Second World War, because I know this off my grandparents. My grandmother actually got sent to Wales to live with a family in Wales during the war. But she also mentioned about, like, she had friends who she never seen again, who got sent to different places and she just never seen again. So who knows, maybe they were sending people even as late as the Second World War. You know, when there's such chaos and so many countries are on lockdown and shut down, much like we've seen in the last year, you know, who's there to keep an eye out on these things? Who's there to write down the information that we can then learn about? I mean, I'd be interested to see in the next 12 months, when people start trying to get out to these monuments and sites around the world, has anything changed in the last year? Has anything been removed from walls, from artwork and things like that? But again, let's get back to the story.
You know, kids in that sort of situation, you can teach them in history you want. In Florence, Italy, there were 1,200 foundling hospitals in Florence, Italy, around about 1880. All unwed mothers in that time were required to hand your child over to a foundling hospital. In 1 year, there was two hospitals in Florence collected 97,000 foundlings in 1 year. That's the level of children. 635,000 children across Europe in the year 1880. Where all these children come from? Where did they all go? What was it all about? Where are all these foundlings going from? With the culture that was here before, tartaria, the culture...
Sorry to jump in again, but that just goes to show you as well, you know, these kids might not have had parents, because the parents might have been taken out, and that policy is the cover policy. You know, that's the document, but what's happening with the actions. Now, like he says, about the 635,000 children in 1 year in 1880, that's 150 years ago. That's 150 years ago. That's only a few generations ago. So just picture in your own mind now, whatever country you're living in, just picture 100,000 children getting picked up, taken to another nation to start an actual culture in that nation, a civilization, if you will. It's incredible. It's absolutely incredible.
The culture that came before this culture, the culture that we're not being told about, they also had electricity, producing electricity. Okay? Buildings producing electricity, like a free energy, Tesla sort of stuff. And you've got tournaments happening with people using electrical weapons. These buildings, these old buildings, if you look at them, there's every indication that these aren't actually cathedrals. These are power stations. There's power stations and healing centres. When you look at these things, all these old churches, all the stained glass windows are made of crystal. This is all granite, which is all crystal. They've all got copper tops on them. And what else does that? You ever have a crystal radio set when you're a kid? crystal radio set. It's just copper wire crystals. It produces its own electricity, produces its own energy. It harvests the signal. You can tune in and listen to the radio. All you need is crystal and copper and ground it and put it all together. These churches are giant crystal radio sets. They're giant power accumulators. That's what they seem to be designed to do. And who built this stuff? What was the type of civilization that came before? Well, a good clue might be the size of the front doors on these places, you know. All these old buildings have got really huge front doors for really big people. Now, you've seen some of the stuff, I'm sure, that Stephen and Evan Strong would have showed you today, that everything's not what they're telling us as far as human beings and all this sort of stuff goes. So these giants that people talk about, they say they find remnants of, the photos that exist of them, they're everywhere. They're everywhere.
Jeez, look at the size of this guy picking up some kind of bull. Wow. So this is another thing as well. I mentioned earlier on about the giants. You know, where the Tartarians giants, I suppose, is one way of looking at it. It's that the gene that's remnant in society today. You know, you get the giant gene, whatever it is, where you get giantism, where people go to like 7.5, 8. I think the record's like 9 feet tall. But yet, here's actual photographs of huge individuals. So these don't look like they've got some kind of disorder. And it's when you see more than one in the same photograph, that's when the interest really peaks, because all these photographs are showing one tall individual. So you'd say, well, maybe that is a genetic disorder. You've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 people in that photograph, and then a giant. Then that's 1 in 8 just in that photograph. So you're like, you know, okay. But when you see 2 or 3 huge individuals in one photograph from the same area at the same time, and they do not seem to have medical deformities, then you'd have to look at that and think, well, they are just really large people. They are giants, in essence.
Quite recently. You know, so is there something that happens and somehow we get reduced in size every time? I don't know, but it's very...
See, like that photograph there with the 2 large individuals next to the lady in the middle of them. They are big people. Let's not mess around here. They're giants. Like, simple as that.
Interesting that these photos should exist. But essentially, folks, everything that they give us is an illusion. Everything they brought us is an illusion. You know, and they used in World War II, these things here, these devices, they say these are acoustic locators. Okay? Acoustic locators is what they used to use before radar, because they wanted to know where the planes were coming from. So a guy would sit there with 2 big ears and he'd listen to what's going on, and he'd hear the planes coming. Oh, okay. And have them on these swivels so they could see that was their radar back then. But that one looks pretty weird. That doesn't look like the same type of acoustic locator. And what about these things? What's that? Are they acoustic locators, or are they some sort of sound, energy, electromagnetic, whatever weapons? Sound frequency. Sound is very powerful. You just done a sound healing, I believe.
Yeah, it's a very interesting photograph, that. Obviously, I can see a lot of wheels on there, very mechanical. Almost, is it steam? It looks like it potentially could be steam powered. Maybe, you know, you got all these valves and things like that. And in essence, they look like large trumpets. And we all know, like, some of the mythology. You know, let's go and look at somewhere like Machu Picchu, for example. And there was a chap, forgive me his name, he was allegedly the person who built Machu Picchu on his own, using sound. And he was able to levitate the stones, move them around, and place them in the right place, in situ, up at altitude at Machu Picchu. Now, the sound device that this person allegedly used was allegedly buried in Machu Picchu. And I seen a number of years ago where they did, like, it wasn't LiDAR, I think it was more like a ground penetrating radar, to be honest. And they looked behind the door of this sealed section of Machu Picchu, and there was metallic objects. Now, that's where the story ends on that, unfortunately, because that's where the story ends. But it goes to show, you know, like, this thing in the mind of our history, that sound is very powerful and things like that. The powers of acoustics is very prominent. So if someone was able to use sound and focus it into a weapon, because we know sound travels in waves, if you can narrow the waves and really force it, of course it can penetrate objects, or at least cause damage to objects. But that's a very fascinating image, that. Because obviously it looks like you've got some of your average artillery pieces in the background, unless they're similar and you just can't make out the detail. But obviously you've got officers coming to inspect this device here. This isn't your average foot soldiers who are operating this device. These are your officers of the military coming to inspect this. So this is obviously a very advanced piece of kit, or a very important piece of kit at the minimum.
Sound is very, very powerful. And what's this thing? An acoustic locator. This is World War I technology. You know? This is electromagnetic stuff. And what about this? What, an acoustic locator? These look like sound weapons. You ever seen what happens in an earthquake, how the ground liquefies? And how you can do that sort of stuff from sound? You can create that type of a frequency. In an earthquake, that's actually what happens, folks. It isn't just the crustal plates moving. You get that.
Sorry, that's fascinating, that, yeah, because it's like when I said about the mud floods of Atlantis and the alleged mud floods of Tartaria. How would you liquefy mud? I'm guessing through some kind of heavy vibration, or potentially using tones, sound tones. Was this and I've mentioned before about the fact that the British, when they engaged with the Boers, they were unable to win their engagements. They lost pretty much every engagement that they had with the Boers. So how would you go around beating them if you can't actually beat them? Well, you've heard like scorched earth policies in the military, you know, destroy the land around the army and then starve them out, or, you know, isolate them, maybe let them turn on themselves and things like that. But what if you actually just liquefied the ground around them? Say they were held up in cities, and most major cities were held on the banks of rivers. You know, maybe this was part of that liquidation of the mud that led to the mud flood, was these kind of technologies. And like I've already mentioned, you know, the Boer Wars, the revolutions that go right across the globe pretty much. You know, maybe this was the technology, maybe the Boer Wars, the First World War, the Second World War, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, all these revolutions and conflicts was all the eradication of Tartaria. And that was only a few generations ago. And it's gone. It's pretty much gone.
It isn't just the crustal plates moving, you get that shake up and the ground literally turns to liquid and begins to flow. Is that what happened? Do the buildings sink? Was it done with sound frequency? But like I said, this here is an electric gun. This is the electric gun that this guy invented in the middle of the 1800s, right? The new electric gun, they said, was going to revolutionise war. This is back in the middle of the century before last, right? Electric weapons. Here's an electric cannon. No gunpowder. This is all the stuff that they were using that they said was revolutionising war back in the 1800s, in the mid-1800s. Why don't we hear about any of this stuff? His death ray that he created. This is a German guy who created a death ray. This was the Japanese death ray. These are all from the 1800s, these pictures, okay?
And we know about the death ray from Nikola Tesla. Obviously, Nikola Tesla, genius, who came from Serbia, I believe it was, somewhere around Russia, the Baltics, in and around that area. And he invented a death ray. He invented alternating current, capacitors, conduits, you know, he invented wireless transmissions, all kinds of stuff. Nikola Tesla was an absolute genius. Yet, when he spoke of these things, he didn't see himself as a genius, he see himself as someone who was continuing work that was already taking place. He was just improving technology. Obviously, you had Edison, who already had single current, so electricity was known. Now, when Nikola Tesla was brought over to America, obviously he was well funded. I think it was J.P. Morgan. He was well funded. He was able to carry on his work in relative peace and quiet up until a point where he started to get really advanced technologies. At this point in his life, it seems as though Nikola Tesla was basically shoved underground. A lot of his work went underground. Indeed, when he passed away, obviously there was a lot of all his notebooks, big suitcases full of notes, up and left. Apparently the CIA took them. And you know, this is just another example of just hiding information, hiding data. Where is all that Nikola Tesla information? Obviously, if it's like you know, security reasons, then they're not gonna divulge the information. But we've got information that people are sourcing readily, like death rays in Japan, death rays in Germany. So they didn't have to give you the blueprint of this technology, but they could have at least let us peek into the mind of Nikola Tesla himself and see all his works, because I think it'd open up a lot more avenues into things like this and the sound wave technology. Unfortunately, universities and, like I say, major corporations are not interested in this, in giving us this information. We have to source it and find it ourselves, and it's a shame. But the fact that there's death rays in other nations outside of the sphere of Nikola Tesla goes to show the influence of Nikola Tesla. Goes to show you that, you know, there was a global understanding of electricity before Tesla and Edison. And yeah, it's riveting stuff, to be honest.
There's a Texan guy who created a novel one, the novel Electric Gun. You know, and so they put out fantasy books and stuff to try to lead you away from it. This guy, Thomas Swift and the Electric Rifle. Thomas A. Swift and the Electric Rifle, Taser. That's where they got the name from. Taser. And as I said, you know, when you look at all this stuff that I've showed you about history and the recycling of people, even with the giants, I mean, I speculate. You know, even stories of Atlantis and stuff like that. How many cultures have there been? How many civilizations have there been? And some of the giants that I showed you, I mean, they're the small ones. There's ones you could find prior to that. There were bigger ones. So what happens? I mean, do we get smaller and smaller in size all the time? Is that what's going on? What's going on? Is there some sort of weird genetic...
Which is actually quite hilarious, because I was taught in school that people have actually got taller, and that if you go back hundreds of years, thousands of years, that people actually used to be really, really small, which is just fascinating, isn't it? That, you know, it's almost like that classic switch and bait, you know, just say the opposite and stand by it until eventually it changes the narrative changes enough people's minds, and the narrative that the truth becomes the lie, you know.
Experiment going on? I don't know. It's very difficult to get to the bottom of this. But just the whole concept that our history is completely fabricated is a hard one for people to swallow. Everyone's got this whole, you know, we came from the Roman Empire and the British colonies, went and did all this stuff. You know, the Dark Ages and all this stuff, there's actually a Russian guy called Anatoly Fomenko. I recommend you look at his books as well. And he has put forth the notion that the Dark Ages was an invention. 1,000 years that they just put in there because they needed to push all this stuff back in history to give us the concept that it's been this feudal culture that built up to what it is. But nowhere in any of it will you find any mention of Tartaria. And I'll tell you, if you go start looking at maps from the 1500s back, anywhere from around about maybe the mid-1600s back, you're going to find Tartaria on all of these maps. And like I said, you'll even find a reference of it in 1942. They were talking about erasing Tartar history. You know, Mongols, China, India, it was all one culture. And it all seemed to be a culture that was quite harmonious, you know, with free energy and normal trade, quite tolerant culture.
A very multicultural culture as well. Seems as though the Tartars was not necessarily a race. Well, maybe the Tartars were a race, but the Tartarian Empire was not a race-focused empire. As far as my research has led me to believe, it was a spiritual empire, much like what led into the Holy Roman Charlemagne Empire, where, you know, the Habsburgs and all this kind of stuff, which again, you know, the Habsburg dynasties seem to have been swept under the rug, and we're only going back a few hundred years for that kind of information. You know, the age of chivalry and all that kind of stuff. Pretty much what he's saying, the Dark Ages.
You know, and so, you know, history's completely wrong, folks. It's completely wrong. So the question is, how many times does this happen? And is it due to happen again?
Okay, so there we have, guys. I was quite happy with that video, to be fair. He went on to discuss a lot of things I was hoping he would discuss. And I had a lot of thoughts in my mind before I watched the video, and I'm quite happy that, you know, I seem to be on a similar path to this man in his research. And, you know, I'm sorry if I rambled on a little bit, guys. I do ramble a little bit, can't help that. But the information that's out there, and the maps, the landmarks, the wars, like I say, the migrations, the movements of hundreds of thousands of children, the technologies, the sound waves, the potential for harmonic resonance, displacing the soil and creating mud floods. You know, it all seems to be very elusive. But then when you apply tartaria into the centre of it, and a spiritual culture, and then look at it through the modern lens of globalism, atheism, as I've put in previous videos, the destruction of monuments, spirituality, and identity, really, you know, it all starts to make sense. And I'm only so far along my journey. God knows where the finish line's going to be. But I hope this video can inspire more people to get on this journey and help the community at large, find more information out and reach new people and influence the future, hopefully. So yeah, thanks for stopping by, guys. Hope you all have a lovely day. Peace.